He walked into that office with a folder, a rehearsed pitch, and absolutely no idea. She recognized him the moment he turned around. He didn't recognize her at all. Welcome back to Tales by Laju. Before we begin, I want you to imagine something. Imagine standing in the cold with two small children, less than $50 in your purse, and nowhere to go. The person you trusted the most has just walked away, and your entire life changes in a single moment. Now, imagine meeting that same person 10 years later when they need something from you. Today's story is about heartbreak, resilience, second chances, and what happens when life comes full circle in the most unexpected way. If you enjoy powerful stories like this, please don't forget to subscribe and share the story with whoever you think needs it. And one more thing, can you just let me know where you're watching from? I would really like to know. Now, let's get into the story. She had $43 in her purse. That was it. $43, 2 children under 5, and 2 suitcases sitting on the cold concrete of South Station in Boston. It was a Thursday morning in November, the kind of cold that doesn't ask permission before it bites you. Sandra Hunt stood there watching the silver Toyota Camry pull away from the curb. She didn't run after him. She didn't call his name. She just stood there watching the car disappear around the corner, thinking maybe, just maybe, Martin would turn around. Maybe he had forgotten something. Maybe this was not what she thought it was, but the car didn't come back. Her daughter, Jillian, was 4 years old and holding Sandra's left hand. Her son, Leo, was 2. He didn't understand anything. He was just happy to be outside, pointing at pigeons and laughing. Sandra looked down at her children and felt something crack open inside her chest. Martin Jackson had said the words that morning very calmly. "I can't do this anymore, Sandra." That was all. No shouting. No big dramatic scene. Just those 7 words, spoken like he was talking about a job he was tired of. He had packed a bag the night before. Sandra had noticed, but told herself it was for a work trip. He traveled sometimes. She had told herself a lot of things over the years. She had met Martin when she was 22. He was charming then. Tall, funny, always had a plan. He talked about building a future like it was something he could already see. A house in Newton, a business, vacations to places with warm water. Sandra had believed every word. She believed in him more than she believed in herself. They got married after 2 years. Jillian came quickly after that. Then Leo, but somewhere between the second baby and the mountain bills, Martin changed. Or maybe he had always been this way and Sandra had been too in love to notice. He stopped coming home on time. He started blaming Sandra for things. The apartment was messy, dinner wasn't right, she was too tired, she didn't talk to him the right way. He found reasons to be disappointed in everything she did. Sandra had tried. Lord knows she tried. She had gone back to community college part-time while caring for both kids. She had taken on freelance bookkeeping work from home. She had cut back on everything, groceries, heating, her own clothes, just to keep the family steady. But Martin had started talking about leaving Boston, about starting fresh somewhere. He said it with excitement, like it was a plan they would do together. That Thursday morning, she understood it was a plan he was doing alone. She stood at South Station for nearly an hour before she finally sat down on one of the benches inside the terminal. Jillian asked where Daddy was going. Sandra said she didn't know. Leo fell asleep on her shoulder. She called her mother in Dorchester. Her mother, Kelly Hunt, answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom?" Sandra said, "I need help." There was a pause on the line. "Come home," Kelly said. No questions, no judgment, just 2 words. And somehow those 2 words were enough to make Sandra finally cry. Kelly Hunt's house in Dorchester was small. 3 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard that flooded every spring. But it was warm, and it was safe. And for the first few months, that was everything Sandra needed. She moved into the back bedroom with both kids. Jillian slept on a cot. Leo shared a toddler mattress on the floor. Sandra slept on a full-size bed she had grown up in as a child. She would lie awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how she had ended up back in the same room she had slept in at 16. The shame of it nearly swallowed her whole. Martin had not called. Not once, not to check on the children, not to explain himself, not even to say he was sorry. He had simply vanished from their lives, the way smoke vanishes in wind, completely and without a trace. Sandra filed for child support through the courts. The caseworker told her it could take months. She nodded and took the paperwork home and put it in a folder and tried not to think about it every single day. She found work at a small accounting firm in Jamaica Plain. It wasn't much, entry level, 40 hours a week, not great pay, but it was steady. Kelly watched the kids in the mornings before school. Sandra would leave at 7, work until 5, pick up Julian from kindergarten, and come home to make dinner and help with homework and bathe Leo and try to keep everything from falling apart. She was 28 years old and she felt 60. But something was happening underneath all that exhaustion, something quiet and stubborn. Sandra was learning. Every day at the firm, she watched how the senior accountants worked. She asked questions. She took notes. She enrolled in an online certificate program through UMass Boston, finance and business management, and studied after the kids went to sleep. Some nights she only got 4 hours of rest. She drank too much coffee and her hands shook sometimes, but she kept going. "You're going to run yourself into the ground," Kelly told her one evening. "Maybe," Sandra said, "but I'm going to run somewhere first." Kelly looked at her daughter for a long moment, then she nodded. She understood. There were hard days when the child support check was late and Sandra had to decide between buying milk or paying for Jillian's school field trip. Days when Leo got sick and she had to miss work, and her boss, a thin, impatient man named Caleb Mason, would look at her sideways and say things like, "We need people who are committed, Sandra." Days when she sat in her car in the parking lot of the firm and let herself cry for exactly 5 minutes before wiping her face and going back inside. She never let the children see her break. That was the deal she made with herself. Whatever happened, Jillian and Leo would not grow up thinking their mother was defeated. They would grow up watching her work. They would grow up knowing that survival was not the same thing as giving up. It was the beginning of something else. She got her certificate. Then she went back for more. By the time Sandra was 32, she had moved out of her mother's house. It was a Tuesday in March when she signed the lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in Roxbury. Nothing fancy, 3rd floor, 1 bathroom, a kitchen window that looked out at a fire escape, but it was hers. Every square foot of it was something she had earned. Jillian was 8 by then. Leo was 6. They helped carry boxes up the stairs that afternoon, Leo insisting he could carry a box, much too heavy for him. Jillian carefully unpacking her books and arranging them on a shelf she had picked out herself. Sandra stood in the empty living room that evening after the kids were in bed and put her hands on her hips and breathed. This is the beginning, she told herself, not the end, the beginning. She had changed jobs twice since leaving Caleb Mason's firm. Each move was deliberate, each one a step up. She had developed a reputation in Boston's financial sector as someone who could look at a struggling business, find where the money was leaking and fix it. Her clients started telling other clients, word spread. At 34, she joined a mid-sized financial consulting firm on Boylston Street as a senior analyst. Her salary was now more than 4 times what she had earned at that first job in Jamaica Plain. She bought herself one good coat, a dark wool one, and she wore it like armor. She was not flashy about any of it. She drove a sensible car. She saved carefully. She put money into a college fund for both children every month without fail, even when it was tight. She did not go on vacations she couldn't afford or spend money impressing people who didn't matter. Martin Jackson had spent money that way. Sandra had watched him do it, and watched the family fall apart around the spending. She would not repeat that. She dated a little, cautiously, nothing serious. She did not have the energy or the trust for serious yet. At 36, a contact from her network reached out about a startup, a lending and financial services company called Bridgeway Capital, just getting off the ground in downtown Boston. They needed someone who understood both numbers and people. Someone who could build something from scratch. The offer was equity and a leadership role. It was risky. Sandra sat with it for 2 weeks before she said yes. She worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. 18-hour days, weekends, phone calls at midnight. She restructured the company's lending model, brought in institutional partners, negotiated deals with banks that didn't take her seriously at first, and then had to. Within 3 years, Bridgeway Capital was turning real profit. Within 5, they had expanded to 3 offices in Massachusetts. Sandra Hunt was named CEO at 40. She stood at the podium at the company's 5th anniversary event, held at a hotel in Back Bay, and looked out at the room full of staff and clients and investors. She thought about the bus station. She thought about $43. She thought about the cot in her mother's back bedroom and the parking lot where she used to cry. She didn't say any of that out loud. She just smiled and gave the speech she had prepared. But she felt every word of it all the way down. It was a Wednesday, mid-October. Sandra's assistant, a sharp young woman named Tricia, had sent through the week's meeting schedule on Monday morning. Wednesday afternoon was blocked out for a series of loan consultation meetings, small business owners seeking capital through Bridgeway's community lending program. Sandra sometimes sat in on days personally. She believed in seeing the people her company served. It kept her grounded. She was running a few minutes late from a call with their legal team, so she walked into the conference room while the first applicant was already seated with his back to the door. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she said, moving toward her chair at the head of the table. The man turned around. Sandra stopped. For a fraction of a second, no longer than a heartbeat, everything in the room went very still. Martin Jackson was sitting across the table from her. He was older, of course. His hair had started to go grey at the temples. He had put on weight around the middle. His suit was decent but not expensive. He looked like a man who had tried several things and was now trying this. He was holding a folder of business documents in both hands, and he had the practiced, slightly nervous energy of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say. He did not recognize her. That was the thing that hit Sandra hardest. Not the anger, not the old grief, but the simple fact that he looked right at her face and saw a stranger. She had changed too, of course. She had grown into herself in a way that she hadn't been at 28, standing cold and broken at a bus station. She was wearing a jacket that cost more than a month's rent had cost her back then. She sat down. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "I'm Sandra Hunt, CEO of Bridgeway Capital. I understand you're here to discuss a business loan application?" Martin nodded and gave a professional smile. "That's right. Thank you for seeing me. My name is Martin Jackson. I run a small logistics company out of Quincy, been operating about 4 years. We're at a stage where we need capital to scale, and a colleague suggested Bridgeway as a good fit. Tell me about the business," Sandra said, and he did. She listened. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes without stopping, the way people do when they practice something until it sounds smooth. Martin's company was called East Line Freight Solutions. 4 trucks, 6 employees, contracts with a few mid-sized warehouses in the South Shore area. He wanted to expand 2 more trucks, a small depot space in Braintree, working capital for operations while revenue caught up. He was asking for $250,000 over a 5-year term. His financials were average, not bad, not great. He had kept decent records. His credit history had some rough patches from about 8 to 10 years ago. Sandra clocked that immediately, but had improved steadily. He had clearly worked hard to get here. She watched him talk. She watched his hands, his eyes, the way he leaned forward when he believed his own pitch. She thought about the man who had loaded a bag into a silver Camry while his 2-year-old slept in the next room. She wondered if he ever thought about that day. She wondered if he had looked for the children, even once. She kept her face completely neutral. When he finished, he looked at her expectantly. "You have a copy of your incorporation documents?" she asked. "Right here." He slid them across the table. She reviewed them without hurry. Then she looked up. "Mr. Jackson, I'm going to be honest with you about a few things I'm seeing in this application." He nodded. "Of course, I appreciate directness. Your revenue growth is solid," she said. 16% year over year for 3 years is respectable. Your debt-to-income ratio is slightly high, but manageable. The weak point is cash flow. You have about 6 weeks of operating runway at current burn, which makes lenders nervous. He nodded slowly, like he had heard this before and hoped someone would look past it. "We'd need to see a stronger cash reserve before advancing the full amount you're requesting," Sandra continued. "However, and I want to be clear about this, that doesn't mean the application is dead. It means the structure needs to change. We could look at a phased disbursement model. First tranche, conditional on 3 months of improved cash flow documentation." Martin leaned forward slightly. His whole posture changed. The relief in it was visible. "That would actually work for us," he said. "We have 2 contracts renewing in January that should shore up the cash position significantly. Have Trisha send you the documentation requirements before you leave today," Sandra said. She closed the folder. "Is there anything else about the application you'd like to discuss?" "No," Martin said. "This has been really helpful. Really." He paused. "Can I ask, how long has Bridgeway been doing community lending? My colleague said you started this program recently." "About 2 years," Sandra said. "It matters to us to work with business owners who aren't being served well by traditional banks." Martin smiled. It was his old smile, warm, easy, the one she had fallen in love with at 22. "Well," he said, "it makes a difference, believe me. Some of us have been through a lot to get to a table like this." Sandra looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Yes," she said, "some of us have." She waited until she heard the elevator doors close before she walked to her office window. Boston spread out below her, the harbor in the distance, the grey October sky pressing down on the buildings, the street full of cars and people who had no idea what had just happened in that conference room. Sandra stood there with her arms crossed and breathed slowly in, slowly out. Trisha knocked and opened the door a few inches. "You okay? You look a little..." "I'm fine," Sandra said. "Pull up the full background check on the Jackson application before we move forward. Standard due diligence. Also flag it to my review queue personally. I want to sign off on every step." Trisha nodded and disappeared. Sandra sat down at her desk. She pulled out the bottom drawer, the one she rarely opened during work hours. Inside was a photograph. She had kept it there since her first week at Bridgeway, a small anchor, a reminder of where she started. It was a picture of Gillian and Leo from that first Christmas at her mother's house. Leo was 3, wearing a red sweater with a reindeer on it. Gillian was 5, grinning with her 2 front teeth missing. Sandra was kneeling between them, and if you looked closely, you could see the tiredness around her eyes, but she was smiling. She was holding her children, and she was smiling. She put the photo back. She called Gillian first. Gillian was 20 now and studying business at Northeastern, a fact that made Sandra cry at the orientation, though she had sat very still and not let anyone see it. Leo was 18, finishing high school, already talking about engineering. "Mom," Gillian answered. "Aren't you in the middle of your Wednesday meetings?" "I am," Sandra said. I wanted to hear your voice." A pause. "You okay?" "Yeah," Sandra said. "I'm great, actually. How's your Tuesday case study going?" They talked for 4 minutes. Small things. Gillian complained about her roommate. Sandra half listened and made the right sounds. When she hung up, she felt steadier. She thought for a long time about what to do. She could kill the application. She had reason to. The cash flow concern was real, not manufactured. Nobody would question her. She could write a standard decline letter and never think about Martin Jackson again. Or she could be exactly what she had promised when she started the community lending program: fair, rigorous, and consistent. She could evaluate his application the same way she evaluated everyone else's. Not because he deserved her grace, but because the program meant something. Because there were employees at Eastline Freight Solutions who had nothing to do with what Martin had done to her, who depended on their paychecks, who had families of their own. She knew what she was going to do. She had known before Gillian answered the phone. She pulled the application back up on her screen and started her notes. 2 weeks later, Martin Jackson received a letter on Bridgeway Capital letterhead. He was at his desk in the Quincy office when it arrived. A modest space above a tie shop, 2 rooms, a wall calendar showing October's dates, still up even though November had started. His office manager brought the envelope in and set it on his desk without comment. He opened it carefully. It was a conditional approval letter. Bridgeway Capital was prepared to advance the first tranche of his loan, $75,000, pending submission of 3 months of updated cash flow documentation and proof of the January contract renewals. The terms were reasonable. The interest rate was fair. There was a note at the bottom from the CEO's office, signed Sandra Hunt, detailing the phased disbursement schedule. Martin sat back in his chair and exhaled. He called his operations manager, a man named Derek, and gave him the news. Derek whooped on the phone. Martin laughed, the real kind, not the performed kind. He thought about calling someone else to share the news, but there wasn't really anyone. His social world had thinned considerably over the past decade. He had made choices. Some of those choices had cost him things he hadn't fully understood he was losing until they were gone. He thought about his children. He had thought about them more than people would expect. In the early years after he left, he had convinced himself that Sandra would be fine, that she was capable, that the kids were young enough not to be affected, that it was better this way. He had told himself the story that made him the least guilty. He had gotten good at that story for a while, but stories like that have a shelf life. He had tried to locate Sandra a few years after leaving through a mutual friend. He had learned she had moved out of her mother's house. The friend didn't know where. Martin had filed that information away and kept moving. He had started the freight company. He had built something modest and real. He had not remarried. He had not allowed himself to. He read the letter again. Sandra Hunt. He thought about the woman across the table. Her steady eyes. The way she had said, some of us have been through a lot to get to a table like this. Something in how she said it had stayed with him for 2 weeks. He couldn't say exactly why. He set the letter down and stared at the wall for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and started gathering the financial documents Bridgeway needed. On the morning the loan cleared and the first tranche transferred to Eastline Freight Solutions, Sandra was in an early meeting with her board. She didn't think about Martin Jackson that morning. She thought about the agenda, about the fourth quarter projections, about the expansion they were considering into Providence. She asked hard questions. She pushed back on 2 proposals she didn't think were well structured. She drank her coffee and made her board members work for every number they presented. After the meeting, Tricia left a message that Mr. Jackson had called to say thank you. Sandra listened to the voicemail once. His voice was different on it, quieter than in the meeting, less performed. He said the loan was already making a difference. He said he was grateful. He said, and there was a pause here, a long one, that he had started to realize he was talking to someone he might have known once, a long time ago. He said if he was right, he understood if she didn't want to respond. He said he was sorry, just that, not an explanation, not an excuse, just a word, spoken plainly into a phone. Sandra sat with the message for a while. She did not call him back. She was not punishing him. She was not holding on to old pain. She had put that pain down years ago, not cleanly, not easily, but she had done it. What she felt when she thought about Martin now was mostly just a kind of tiredness, the tiredness of someone who had carried something very heavy for a very long distance and finally set it down and walked away. She thought about Gillian, sitting in her finance class at Northeastern, learning the same things Sandra had once taught herself in the dark after the children went to sleep. She thought about Leo, who wanted to build bridges, literal ones, structural engineering, rebar and cable and load-bearing beams across Boston Harbor. She thought about her mother, Kelly, who was 68 now and had just started gardening again in the backyard, the one that flooded every spring. Sandra opened her laptop and pulled up the next file. There was a woman in Mattapan who had applied for a small business loan to open a childcare center. Single mother, 3 kids, had been turned down by 2 other lenders. Her application was thin, but her plan was solid and her references were strong. Sandra had flagged it herself 2 days ago. She read the file carefully. She made notes. She thought about what the woman must have felt sitting down to write that application. What it cost to keep trying when everything is telling you to stop. What it means to believe that there is a table somewhere you belong at and then to walk through the door and sit down. Sandra picked up her pen. She wrote, approve. First review, personnel. Then she moved on to the next file and the next, and the city of Boston went on outside her window, going about its ordinary, extraordinary business of people trying and failing and getting up and trying again. And that's the end of today's story. Sometimes the best revenge is not getting even. It's building a life so good that the people who hurt you become part of your past. What would you have done if you were Sandra? Please let me know in the comment section. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to share, subscribe, like, and turn on your notification. I'll see you in the next story.